All right, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining. Very excited to dive into a new Chumash Devarim with all of you. Before we do that, we have a request from one of the group, and we are going to dedicate the learning that we're doing tonight for the following people, for a refuah shlema for the following: Gittel bat Pesa, Leah v'Hillel, Yona Rachamim ben Chayarina, David ben Shoshana, Hedi Gina or Gina bat Aliza, and Svi ben Sonia Avram. They should have a refuah shlema, as should all of those who are sick right now, whether it be from coronavirus or anything else, those close to us, those not close to us, a refuah shlema to all of Am Yisrael and the whole world. Okay. Shoshana bat Nechama as well. Thank you for mentioning that, Dylan. Okay, here we go. Now, Sefer Devarim, it's a whole new world, and we're not going to be delving into a large chunk of text like we have in the past. Really just want to focus on a very small piece of text. But really what we're going to do tonight is hopefully give a frame through which to understand all of Sefer Devarim, so that when you guys do delve into it and we go through it through the next several weeks that we're in it, that we can really understand what it is, because it's really different than the other four Chumashim. It's qualitatively very, very different from the other four. Okay, just to give you guys a little taste of what I mean, there's no new action or drama. There's no new stories. Nothing really happens in Sefer Devarim new to add to the story. Okay, what we get is the overwhelming majority of it, except for the first 5 passages and the last 10 passages, the overwhelming majority is a first-person speech, a very long 40-day speech given over by Moshe Rabbeinu, by Moses, to the whole nation. That's kind of a funny thing, because we were told at the beginning when we met Moshe in Sefer Shmot, Lo ish devarim anochi, I'm not a man of words, aral sfatayim, I have heavy lips. He wasn't supposed to be a person that had an ability to articulate himself. Nevertheless, here we get a whole sefer of a very long and involved speech that he gives us. So I guess he found his voice, right? Moshe found his voice at the end here. We'll try to articulate a little bit about how that works, what Moshe's role is here, and really what is Sefer Devarim. Because just the fact that we can already understand that the rest of the 4 books are third person and the last one is first person, that itself, especially for those who are kind of interested in English literature, that tells us that there's a very different type of story or a different type of tale or a telling that's being told in Sefer Devarim than we had before. Now, the Parshat Devarim that we're going to start off with gives a little bit of an introduction, which we're going to read together, and then it starts to go through some of the events, some of the major events, although all of Sefer Bereshit is missing from here, most of Sefer Shmot, all of the stuff of the Tuma and Tara, the impurity and the purity, all the stuff around the temple, none of that is mentioned, okay? So that's a bit interesting. But however, this book is known as the Mishneh Torah, which is probably best translated as a repetition of the Torah, a retelling of it. Well, what kind of retelling of it doesn't have anything from Sefer Bereshit or anything from the Mishkan or any of those laws for the Kohanim or the Leviim? I mean, what's going on here? What really is this book, and what is it trying to retell us? Okay, so that's the question I'd like to start off with, and we'll clarify the questions as we go forward. Again, in the broad strokes, trying to understand what is this book, Sefer Devarim, and how do we relate to it? Okay, now it starts off with the following passages. Ele devarim asher diber Moshe al kol Yisrael be'ever Yarden. These are the words that Moshe addressed to all of Israel on the other side of the Jordan. This is the east side of the Jordan, right? If you guys remember from last week, we're not on the west bank, we're on the east bank, okay? And Moshe apparently has gathered everyone together for his parting words. The story is over, as I mentioned. Nothing new is added. This is his goodbye speech. He's not coming with Am Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. That task is given to Yoshua. Yeshua will take over the leadership as soon as Moshe passes away, and the story will continue on with him. Okay, in a certain way, if we skipped from Sefer Bamidbar right into Sefer Yoshua, you could argue, well, we wouldn't be missing out on so much. But as we see, we'll be missing out on something really, really essential. Okay. It was in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, that Moses addressed the Israelites in accordance with the instructions that the Lord has given to them. Okay, this is the month of Adar, the 11th month, starting Pesach. The first month being Nisan, not Tishrei. Okay. After he had defeated Sichon, the king of the Amorim, who dwelt in Heshbon, and King Og of Bashan, who dwelt at Ashtaroth and Edrei. So if you remember from last week, there was a battle where Am Yisrael had defeated the two major powers in the region, Sichon and Og. These were major military battles that Am Yisrael had won, and therefore they got all that booty. Okay, so they're still there from last week. Again, nothing new has happened. Now, this is the passage that I want to work on with you guys tonight, which will hopefully open up some answers to the questions that we asked. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching. He said, ... Okay, now the rest of it, again, almost all of it is Moshe saying in first person all of the things that he says, which were, as we go through it over the next couple of months, we'll be able to see. Okay, but here's the question that hopefully will open things up. Why is it that Moshe, we get this little introduction, and we're told that Moshe is going to explain or expound. He's going to be'er what was given beforehand. Why does it need a bior? Why does it need a description or an explanation? I mean, it's not as if we don't have this written down, right? We have the luchot, we have the tablets, and we have the Sefer Torah. We have these four other books that they've been written. So what do we need an explanation for? It should be that everything is all there, ready to go, and we should be able to now go into Eretz Yisrael. What is this biur that we need? And just for you Hebrew scholars there, I know everyone's done at least a little bit of Ulpan Hebrew, if not much more. The word biur has the word or in it. It's really like be'or, that there's new light being brought to someone, which is really what an explanation is, right? In other words, if I say one thing and I say, okay, please explain this to me, you'll hopefully give a new light to whatever it was that was said before. So just in the simple word, bior, we see that Moshe is planning to give some sort of new light. He's going to shine a different light on what it is that we've already been told. And again, just to reiterate, we're told that this is shifting from third person to first person. So we're getting a much broader global perspective, or we could maybe say a divine perspective. We're going to a very intimate and personal perspective. We're getting Moshe's story or Moshe's lens. Okay. Now, I'm not trying to take away from the sanctity or the kedusha of Sefer Devarim to imply that this is all from God and this is from Moshe, but I am trying to point out a distinction between the two. Okay, and we'll see more about that. Now, really, why is this explanation or explication necessary? Why do we need more light on it? Should it not stand on its own? Now, the Ramban, Nachmanides, the famous Sephardic medieval commentator, he has a short introduction to the book of Devarim, and he tries to touch on these questions. I clipped a little bit from it here to try to capture what it is that he understands Sefer Devarim is and its uniqueness. So he says, "V'yachzer lemitzvot hanoagot behem pam leosif behem bior upam shelo yachzer otam rach lahazhir et Yisrael barov asarav." So we go over these laws or these mitzvot that are going to be necessary. They're going to be hanhagot. These are going to be acted out. A good measure for pam leosif behem. One good measure to add on to them. That's very interesting. There's something more that needs to be told about these laws from Moshe's perspective that we didn't get already. Okay? Not only that, there's going to be additional laws that are given that aren't given beforehand. Okay? But even the laws that we are given, the Ramban tells us there's going to be some addition to what we already said, even if it seems repetitive. Okay? Pamlo Sif Behem Bior, one to add to their explanation, and for another good measure, to not just go over them again, just like, a parent saying to the kid again, don't forget, that idol worship stuff, bad, bad, bad. That's a part of it, but no, Rakalaz here at Yisrael B'Rov Azharot, right? In order to really warn them, and not just to, like no, but to give a broad understanding of who we are, why we don't do these things, and in which ways these things are problematic, okay? An additional point that the Ramban adds, V'od Yosif b'Sefer Zeh, Kama mitzvot shelo nizkuru klal. We have several mitzvot that were not mentioned. For example, Yibum, levirate marriage, Motzi Shemra, speaking bad about a certain person, ruining their name, divorce, Girushim B'Isha, divorce wasn't in the previous ones, now it appears. Edim Zomim, which is an interesting, complicated case where you have false witnesses, and others. So wait a second, why didn't those come earlier? So the Ramban says, well, don't worry, these were all given beforehand. Okay, it's not like Moshe kind of made these up on the spot. He saw that better put in a divorce clause just in case, the marriages don't go so well when they get into Israel. It can be tricky to navigate when you get there, so better put in the divorce clause. No, these laws were all given beforehand, but they weren't necessarily going to be enacted or lived until they got to Israel. And therefore, even though Moshe got them from Har Sinai, now is the appropriate time in order to express them. Okay, that's what the Ramban says in the clip that I have here. Now, just to clarify and go over the 3 points that I'm drawing out from the Ramban, so we understand what his perspective on Sefer Devarim is. Number one, to elucidate that which was already given, i.e. further explanation. Okay, like I said, Pamlo Sif Behem Bior. Number two, words of inspiration, warning, and rebuke. Okay, we get a lot of those, chazak ve'amatz. We get a lot of warnings. We get rebuke. We do get inspiration about the possibility of tshuva at the very end of Sefer Devarim, which is one of the most inspiring, beautiful sections of Sefer Devarim that we get right before Rosh Hashanah, which is so perfect. Okay, so there are words of inspiration as well as rebuke in there. And that makes up a lot of what Sefer Devarim is besides the mitzvot that are mentioned. And number three, the mitzvot that are mentioned, why are those there? Those mitzvot that are specifically mentioned are preparation for entering into the land of Israel, okay? And apparently Moshe picked and chose those ones that needed a special emphasis as they're going into the land, okay? So those are the 3 points that the Ramban mentions, what is unique about Sefer Devarim and how we look at it different from the other Chumashim, and why it repeats the sections of the Torah that it does and not other ones. In other words, why didn't we get the flood story? So the Ramban would probably say, well, it doesn't fit into any of these categories. It doesn't need to be elucidated. It doesn't provide necessarily any inspiration, warning, or rebuke, and it doesn't necessarily prepare them for the land of Israel. Okay? So that's what the Ramban says. So that's a good broad frame to understand Sefer Devarim, and if we would just kind of pause there, we could open the book and start to understand it and appreciate it. But Rashi throws a whole wrench into it and says something strange, and many Mefarshim have to try to understand what it is that he says to put that into context of what we said. Okay, now you made it in the Jewish tradition when you get super commentaries written on you, okay? And there's no better king of super commentaries than Rashi. He's got hundreds and hundreds of commentaries written on his commentary. Okay, so that's how he made it. But he's not the only one. The Rambam, okay, in the Mishneh Torah, if you look at his halachic work, the commentaries on that are endless, and the Shulchan Aruch. Mostly the commentaries that make to kind of sell the score and give a bottom line, those are the ones with the most commentaries, just as a kind of a cool side note. Anyway, so Rashi says something here that is going to be very head-scratching, and we'll try to put the pieces together for the rest of the time that we have. Okay, and hopefully this will give us a different, again, perspective on Sefer Devarim. So Rashi says as follows. Now, just to go back up to the passage, this is the introduction before Moshe starts speaking. We said, Be'ever Yarden be'eretz Moav, ho'il Moshe be'er et Torah azot lemor. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook. The word ho'il is a hard word. We're not going to be able to get into that, but it means probably starts. He started to explain and expound upon these teachings. Now the word Rashi picks up, all the commentators pick up, but the word be'er, as we mentioned, needs a little bit of explanation. Why does Moshe need to explain it? Wasn't everything already given? So Rashi says the following. B'shivim lashon pilsha lehem. He explained it in 70 different languages. In the Torah, there's 70 different primordial nations, 70 different languages connected with those 70 different primordial nations. And Moshe is now going to give it over in his best Canadian Quebec French, or he's going to give it, in Spanish, or, all the 70 different languages. I knew Moshe was talented, but I didn't know he's that talented. He spoke all these different languages. The Torah needs to be apparently expressed in many, many different languages, all the primordial languages. Now, if we were just to kind of meditate on that and talk about that, it's kind of a cool thing to think about the Torah not just being a document that is specifically for Am Yisrael, but there's a universal nature to it. It needs to be something that all the nations of the world can have some sort of connection and relationship to. And that's a nice thing to say, but let's really be honest. This is very head-scratching. Rashi's basically saying, no, don't think that the Torah itself needs an explanation. That's all clear. Moshe's coming to expand upon it in all these different languages. What does our friend Pierre in France need that for? I mean, come on. And all these different languages, what would be the purpose of Moshe needing to do this, especially at this point? So, even though we can give a nice answer for it, it should leave us scratching our head more than feeling satisfied. So on that note, let's see how some of the other commentators are going to understand Rashi's words. Now, the first Pirush that I want to share with you guys is a very interesting thinker. Joel, I looked this up based on your question last week to make sure I had an answer for you. He's known as the Hakatav VaKabbalah. He's not a Mikubal, he's not a Kabbalist per se. His name is Rabbi Yaakov Shvi Mecklenburg, 19th century Germany. Okay, so he's a modern Jewish thinker. And he, in his commentary on the point, on the pasuk that we just talked about, Be'er et Torah, he says the following. First, he quotes Rashi. Okay, Lashon Rashi min Rabbeinu Shivim Lashon Pirsha Lehem. 70 different languages. So he says the following. Ein kavanatam al lishonot shara amim. He doesn't mean to say that he's translating it into Swahili. That's not the intention. What is that going to help us? I mean, we're sitting on the bank of the east of the Jordan River. We're ready to go into Eretz Yisrael. And Moshe's going to start to speak Swahili? How would that help at this point? So the Katav Kabbalah says, no. You have to understand it differently. But Selomar, what Rashi really means is the following. B'shivim kavanot. In 70 different intentions or lenses or perspective. Maskim im amaram bimkom or b'makom acher shivim panim l'Torah. That we see that this matches up very nicely with another beautiful ma'amar of Chazal, another rabbinic teaching, that the Torah has 70 faces, 70 facets to it. It's not just, one truth. It's 70 beautiful different facets of truth, just like a gem has multiple facets to it, and you can see the reflection of it, and it shines the light off it in many beautiful ways. So too with the Torah, it has these 70 different facets to shine the light off it in different ways, to give different perspectives. And these are the deeper or more panimiyot, the panim is the internal part of it, the essential part of it, the secretive part of it. Okay, hinting to really more mystical teachings that we extrapolate. That one of the ways we talk about this is that the Torah has a pardes, pshat, remez, drush, and sod. These 4 different levels of the Torah that are kind of like layers of soil that you kind of pull off, if you guys remember from your earth science classes, the model of the earth, and it has all those different layers, and the magma at the bottom, right? So too with the Torah, it has these different layers that you kind of peel off one after the other, or an onion, right, has these different kind of layers that you peel off. So too the Torah has these different layers to it. It has the external layers, it has the internal layers. And so what Rashi really means to tell you is that Moshe is elucidating for them and illustrating to them as they're ready to step into Eretz Yisrael. Don't just take this on face value. Peel away the layers like an onion, and there are so many to delve into. When you get into Eretz Yisrael, this is what you should be involved in. Peeling away the layers and always drawing out new layers. Okay. Now there's a simple meaning of it as well, but there's much, much more to delve into it. Okay, so that's how the Katav Kabbalah understands Rashi, really takes him in a very different perspective. Okay, now the Hamek Devar, he is the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi. What is his last name? He is the great Rosh Yeshiva, the last great Rosh Yeshiva that we have in the Volozhin Yeshiva. The Volozhin Yeshiva is no longer, but it was like the great Lithuanian yeshiva till it was destroyed, I think even in the 20th century, maybe the earliest, maybe even the early 20th century. Yeah, because Rav Kook went there and he studied under the Netziv. So the Netziv has a famous perush on the Torah called the Emek Devar. And he says the following. First, he says Rashi, very nice, but he rejects that as not the simple reading. And he offers his own approach. He says as follows: Shalom lamad adayin Moshe liYisrael, chokrei halakot v'adrashot. You know what Yisrael hasn't gotten yet? They haven't got a good chakira. They haven't got a good, what's a really good way to translate this? Like a whole halachic discourse on unwrapping the layers of the Torah, not from a more mystical perspective, as the Katav of the Kabbalah said, but more of a halachic perspective. Hainu gama mikre bi'er einatakdek b'yotiot v'darshan. Here, this is the point. Gam makom halachot v'mishnayot shalamdan ad ko bi'er he'achem nilmadim min Torah. So we have all these halachot that come out from the Torah, for example. Okay, basar b'chalav. Now, chicken and dairy, if you look in the halacha books, is not allowed. Although, if you look in the Torah itself, there's no problem with chicken parmesan. It seems to be perfectly allowed. How is it that we get from not cooking a goat in its mother's milk to no chicken parmesan? So the Emek Devar says this is what Moshe was trying to give them the keys to. A good chakira, a good halachic keys or the toolbox of extrapolation. Exegesis is the fancy academic way to say this. But a good chakira, when you have a really talented Talmid Hacham that's able to take all the different pieces of the Gemara and the different Mefarshim and put it all together and show all the different sides of it, okay, how it all comes from and is born out from a small 3-word text in the Torah, that the Emek Devar says has not yet been revealed, and therefore Moshe needs to teach them how to do a good chakira. And if you've never had a good chakira, put it on your bucket list, okay? It's something very wonderful and satisfying about really seeing someone being able to put together a lot of different sources from all over Shas, all over the Jewish tradition, and put those together to be able to extrapolate how this process works, okay? So that's the facet that was missing, says the Emek Devar, a good chakira to understand how all of the details of halacha kind of are rooted back into the source of the Torah itself. Okay, and that would answer very nicely why it's a biur. What's an elucidation? It's elucidating for us. Moshe is helping us to understand how to get the process of what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, of the oral Torah, how to start that process. Okay, even though it's all written down, but it's still called the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, a lot more to get to in the few minutes we have. Rabbeinu Bechaya, just outside, I'll mention this. This is very, very interesting. He says, remember who we're dealing with here, okay? These are the children of those who were at Har Sinai. They heard the stories. They heard from their parents, but they didn't experience hearing these laws themselves, or maybe even from Moshe. And that doesn't mean they didn't believe it. They believed it, but there's a difference in the experience of it. So what Moshe is doing is kind of reliving the experience of Har Sinai and Moshe initially giving over the laws to them so they have an experience. And the power of experience, we've spent a lot of time talking about this over the last couple of weeks, even though there is a lacking in the power of experience, there's something awesome about being at the concert, right? And you just look at your friend who you were at the concert with when there was that amazing guitar solo, and you look at each other and you know, wow, we just shared something so awesome together. Okay, so the Havdils, Moshe is trying to play those old tunes again, okay, so to give them that experience of being at the big show, so to speak, so that it has an impact on them. And when they come to Eretz Yisrael, that's something that they'll carry with them. Therefore, that's what Moshe is trying to do. Okay. The Kedushat Levi goes in a very different and very unique and creative direction. And he goes back to Rashi and tries to understand it on a simpler level. He says, why is it? Lama Bier, the Kedushat Levi is one of our great Hasidic masters, Rabbi Yitzhak Levi of Berdichev. He was one of the early Hasidic masters from the 18th century. Okay, so he says, wait a second. Lama Bier Kana Torah B'Shivim Loshon. Why do we get Swahili? What would be the purpose of that? So he explains as follows. Just say this outside. He says as follows, that there's something intrinsic in language, in each of these 70 primordial language, that he says has a chiyut, has a certain life and livelihood. And a nation's livelihood comes from its language. A nation's vitality is born out from its language. Okay, any philosophy of language people out here, there's definitely a lot to unpack with this. It's a really, really interesting statement. And therefore, God in his, wisdom, not just wisdom, but in his ability to see outside of time, understood that there would be a time when Am Yisrael would go into Galut, we would go into exile. And in order to give us a relationship with Torah, we need to have some sort of relationship with language, not just Hebrew. In other words, Hebrew and Eretz Yisrael, those two things are intrinsically combined. But what about when Am Yisrael has to go into exile? So in order to maintain our strength, our connection with vitality and with Torah, God, so to speak, put the Torah in these different languages. And he says very nicely at the end here, and I'll just read this part inside, that's why it says this part of the Torah, Sefer Devarim, was given Be'eretz Moav, outside of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz HaGoyim, it's a non-Jewish land. Chutz la'aretz, Yisrael tzarich leve'er Torah b'kol lashonot b'kdei l'kayem Yisrael b'galut. In order to give us liveliness, vitality, chiyus, as he would probably say, outside of Eretz Yisrael, to be able to grow spiritually, to be able to have access to Torah in whatever language we're speaking, right? In English, French, Spanish, all the different languages that Jews speak all over the world today, there needed to be an expression of Torah in those languages because language is vitality. And therefore, it was given specifically in this space in order to make sure that we had that vitality, that it existed, and when we needed to go into exile, we would have a relationship to that. Now, there's an incredible piece in the Maharal here where he goes into a very lengthy discourse about the relationship between the other four Chumashim in Sefer Devarim, and because of time, we won't be able to see that. But one last point here that I'll leave everyone with that I think is key and essential in understanding really what Sefer Devarim is that Sefer Devarim really represents the brit, the essential connection and relationship between God and the Jewish people. Okay, and when we talk about religion, this isn't really necessarily a word that is used in the Torah. It does use the word eish dat, but it's really talking about a fiery law. It's talking about the laws. It's not talking about a religion, a set of practices, agreed upon practices or religious practices. It's talking about a relationship. And the first four books of the Torah represent God's speaking to us, so to speak. God talking to us. The last section with Moshe talking does not have a distinction as far as Kedusha, but it represents us receiving what we get from God. And the best example I could think of to myself was a love letter. So that God would write a love letter to us, the love letter being the Torah, and God's intentions and his ideas and his expressions are all in this love letter. But what about the person receiving it? When we get that love letter, when the receiver receives something, there's always something added and new to it. There's always my relationship to it, my reflections on it. Oh, I'm so glad that you wrote this part. I'm so glad you remember that memory when we were on the beach together, because that's my favorite memory too. I'm so glad you put that in a letter. Okay, when we receive something of meaning from someone else, there's always what to add to it. There's our perspective on it. So of course, Moshe has to say it in first person. And it really represents the love and connection between God, the giver, and us, the receiver, that we receive this final section of the Torah from a first person perspective, and with Moshe's perspective, add something to it that wasn't there before. And this really makes Sefer Devarim the beginnings of Torah Sheba'al Peh, as we said before, with the Netziv, with the Emek Devar, but from a different perspective, not just the halachot and the laws and how we live them, but about the relationship and about living Torah in a way that it grows and that it evolves. And it's always representative of the closeness and the love that it's experienced between God and the Jewish people. God is the giver, and Moshe and Am Yisrael as the receiver.